Okay, we're recording again. We're starting to part 2, continuation basically of the lecture. Today will be a bit shorter than a normal class. That's the nature of, I think we will finish, I think, about 30, I don't know, by 1/2 if not earlier, 20 past 11. Just so you can plan, and I hope that's okay. We can't really have the same degree of class participation, but we try. So if you want to make comments, we always open up your mic and jump in to ask a question, challenge anything I'm saying. And just generally in the second half, giving some detail about what's really required is in the logistics of what we're doing. Which means we might be interdisciplinary and we might think in terms of a project, and I'm planning to start next week, I think, presenting you with ideas for a project for this class. I mean, I don't know if you've spoken to people who've done this class before, but the assessment for this class is a bit different to usual, and you produce in groups some material that is not like that, that's for a publication rather than an essay. I mean, it's an essay-like in structure, but the implied reader is someone else, something else. It's a different style. Anyway, we'll talk about that in future weeks. But as we do it, project-based or learning or more critical thinking or open thinking, it's still important to stress, even though I'm talking about in a critical way about the rules of disciplines and how they are disciplining us and so on, there are still some things we need to keep. I see that my slide here has got a problem. It should say research ethics and responsibility. See, the D is the translation bit has got stuck inside there, inside that first sentence. But nonetheless, right, this is what. All right, so first of all, critical thinking in the social sciences, we may be a critique of everything, might be a ruthless criticism of everything that exists, might be the credo from Marx, but it doesn't mean that critical scholarship isn't also one of the, if anything goes, critical thinking, critical theory, if anything is up for criticism, if anything goes, then, why not try scientific method as also a possible thing. And to keep best practice scholarship in mind is really important in the critical classroom, to make sure that we follow the criteria of best practice scholarship. So that means research ethics and responsibility for what you say and do, practicing as a responsible ethical researcher. Respect for others' labor and knowledge. This is the fundamental key that we'll talk about when I talk specifically about plagiarism. Respect for the knowledge work of others and the culture of others. Within that, we don't have any rush to judgment. You critically question every position, but critically questioning and then making a final judgment are different things. I mean, there must be final judgments, especially if you're going to write something, but they are also not true forever, maybe. And you don't want to be rushing in without considering as many angles as you can possibly consider. And you won't always be able to remove all of your assumptions. You never can. But you should think, right, is this my individualist point of view? Is this my cultural upbringing? Is this my biased perspective? Or it may be that you're talking about someone who really is problematic, sexist or racist or fascist, and still not rushing to judgment, even though you might make a judgment. So try to understand the material you work with by looking at original sources. Like this is related to a rush to judgment. Don't accept what it says on Wikipedia or what you heard in gossip about someone. Look at the original sources when you can, and even then be skeptical about what they say, but look for yourself. Make your own assessment. Don't accept as gospel truth what somebody else says, especially in like popular sharing sites that are due mainly to they try mainly to simplify and do shorthand for things. Wikipedia basically is a shorthand to understand someone's life, a very small little biography of someone or something. And it can't be the whole story. I mean, there's always much more. And we have an obligation, ethical responsibility to look further and things. So that's why Wikipedia is never the last word. It might be the first word you look up, but that's a shortcut that you don't really need because you always want to look more deeply into something. I mean, if you looked at even though it's quite elaborate, the website on Marx, you'll see so many misrepresentations. Or think about the way in which people make shorthand comments about Vietnam in the context of COVID. Or so many things about someone's identity, or about their gender, and so on. So we want to have values that are collaborative, not individualistic and selfish, not opportunistic, that are transparent and inclusive and transparent, critical, sure, innovative. You know, there are lots of different ways in which we can describe positively what we're trying to do. But the main criteria is to go for the highest international standards and best practice, but also having a say in what those international standards will be and what is best practice. It might be something that comes from in the local, not just the international. The local is part of the international now. So we need to think in those terms, which is dialectic or complicated. But, well, you know, always ongoing. I mean, there's always more to do. The thing about knowledge is it's not final. Knowledge, it's always unfinished. There's always more to say about something. Now, sure, you have to write where you're at right now. In any text that you write, you say where you're at right now, but you want to keep going as well. You might change that opinion or change that view or move forward, move more deeply, more metaphors of flow, move forward more deeply, more further down the stream, so to speak. I mean, there are lots of, see how knowledge is a metaphor? What is knowledge? It's a way of speaking about what we think. And we don't think necessarily in fields. Well, so we start with what we know, we start where we are, and we start with others that we know, and we assume that they also know. Now, it might be that the people you might want to write about are not the ones you agree with. Like, we make studies of racists, we make studies of fascists, but you still try to understand how they understand their world and get inside there. I mean, you can't always get inside their thinking of who you write about, right? So, I mean, the example would be, I'm just trying to think of an example. If you wanted to understand what motivates someone who does suicide bombing, we don't actually get to know, because what makes them do it, they are not available to be interrogated, to be questioned, to be understood. They're suicide. But we can kind of pretend to try with empathy to understand what they're doing, even if we completely disagree with that kind of action. That's a kind of respect for knowledge. Hello, darling. Yes, you have a snack and don't interrupt me. No, I'm in my class. Sorry, it's break time for them. So, yeah, it's like ethical responsibility to get to know how people think, even if you don't agree with how they think. And it's ethical responsibility as a academic or scholarly value is information. It's one that's also changing as we have different criteria for deciding our ethics, right? And that's the nature of ethics. Ethics changes over time. I don't know if anyone remembers that I gave a talk in the anthropology class on ethics. And it's interesting to look at how anthropologists thought of ethics. I mean, they started to discuss ethics because of the Vietnam War and the way in which anthropologists were employed by the US as a kind of covert front to get Highlander groups to fight on the side of against the communists. And American anthropologists found that problematic, and they started to write ethical guidelines in the late 60s, early 70s. And then every decade they've had to rewrite the guidelines because ethical responsibility has changed. So now it includes, well, in the 90s it started to include questions about photography, because that became, visual anthropology became a big thing in anthropology. That wasn't there in the 60s, in the 70s at all, really, even though there were visual anthropologists from the 30s onwards. But in the 70s it became something that, in the 90s it became something that required an ethical response, a statement in the ethical guidelines to think about what it is to take someone's photograph. And I don't mean in the cliched way of like so-called savage people thought that their spirit was being captured by a photograph. No, but a responsibility to who you represent in the photographic work. And here the work of Azoulay, Ariella Azoulay, is very interesting because she talks about the civil contract of photography. I talked about that. Then in the 2010s, the rewrite of the ethical guidelines has really included, what's new there is animals, having an ethical response to animals. It's not like anthropologists are vegetarians or something, but that the ontological status of many peoples in the world that anthropologists traditionally worked with included a co-constitutive relationship with animals, and that wasn't really recognized previously. That was an assumption that Western anthropologists basically made, that animals were things you farm rather than something more fundamental. Now, you may disagree or not even understand that, and I must confess, as a meat eater. And yet, the co-constitution of people in the Sundarbans in India, for example, with tigers that control their forests, is a real factor. It does shape their culture and life, and you to understand them, you need to understand that relationship and the way they talk about that, the way that they understand that relationship. Even if you can't believe it, they do believe that they are in a sort of spiritual relationship with these tigers and animals. Now that would have probably existed in the Delta here in Vietnam as well, but development has changed. War and development has changed the nature of the Delta. I mean, tigers in Vietnam are much less present than they were, let's say. I mean, if you read some of the old studies of the social sciences in country areas and highland forest areas in Vietnam in the 19th century, tigers are a big feature. Well, yeah. Anyway, ethical responsibility also includes the scholarship value of respecting others' work. So I talk about this a lot because this is a bugbear of mine. I am not the person that wants to campaign against plagiarism, but we need to not do plagiarism. To not copy, and to properly reference. This is an academic value, to properly recognize the labor of others, to cite properly according to the conventions where it's necessary. In a couple of weeks, we'll go through, again, the exact referencing system. But there are plagiarism guidelines. I send them out a lot. If I haven't sent them to you, it means I haven't caught you at it. But I've had a couple of repeat crimes. So you only cheat yourself, but you also risk the reputation of the university. If we want to become internationally known, we don't want to become internationally known for not writing our own essays. And that damages me, that damages you, that damages the university. So we need to not insult our own intelligence by copying, taking shortcuts. If you can't do the paper, you can't do the paper. To copy it from somewhere else is amongst the most serious crimes. I don't want to be the police, and yet I get forced to be if you copy. Wow, I can't stress this one enough, and yet I don't want to at the same time. What to do? Please read this slide. Please learn this point. Right? It's of real importance. And if you plagiarize, you get a 0 in this course. Okay, in the context, I was talking about privatization and internationalization, right? And I talked about some issues like capacity and so on. Let's talk about, before we get into looking at the CBI, the problems we face in the university sector, I mean. When we're thinking about the site of critical thinking, which is inside the university. It's not the only site, of course. Heaven forbid. But also, it should be where we preserve and protect critical thinking from forces that outside that want to shape, understandably want to shape our thinking. I mean, these are as big global historical shifts and consequences. Cold War, real war, colonialism, history, right? Globalization, westernization, cultural decay, cultural memory, or nationalism, cultural chauvinism, or so on. Right? And I think in terms of this, a really good writer about this is Ashish Nandy and his concept of the intimate enemy. The globalization, westernization is somehow in our heads now because of the culture. We are subject to it all the time. And yet, it's also our enemy, because if it shapes what we think, we succumb to it, and we succumb to the history of the politics of globalization has not been universally fair or even. Now, in that context, we are, because of the violence of colonialism, of exploitation, of historical wars, and resistance to wars, of course, that changes it, but raises the question of capacity and experience and confidence. I mean, you can get confidence from resistance, even if you are the oppressed, and yet not always, of course. Experience you get, and capacity you build. But there's no cutting corners, no easy road, hence the plagiarism rule, but hence also the need to read, to need to do the work in order to then be able to have a say and to be heard. and this is Spivak's concept of the subaltern, right? To be on the path of away from subalternity, so that you are entered into the structures of the flawed structures, the logistics of democracy, where you should be able to speak and be heard. And of course, being heard, speaking is not the be-all and end-all, right? You have to be able to speak and for someone to hear what you're saying, not to talk over you, not to misinterpret, misconstrue, or differently understand, misunderstand, hear what you're saying, but then interpret it differently. I mean, so many cultural examples of that. It's not funny. Taking into account cultural factors, mores, hierarchy, party respect structures, autonomy, responsibility, so many different values that enter and clash with the so-called universal, and that's a rhetoric, universal values of globalization, industrialization, internationalization. Because we need to be reviewing educational thinking and recognizing how monetization, financialization, standardization, socialization, democratization, international integration, so many buzzwords, keywords that come with assumptions that we have to think critically about. To not let any of those points pass by without thinking what they're actually, what's actually at stake. I mean, if you talk about standards in education, what do you really mean? Do you mean everyone having the same baseline from which they then become creative, or do you mean everyone having the same outlook, which is more problematic? If we talk about democratization, what do we mean? Do we mean democracy like they have in America, where you vote for Tweedledum or Tweedledum every 4 years and never really participate in the electoral process? Or something else that's really more democratic, where you have recallable delegates? You know, the ideal of democracy, one vote, one person, is a bit of a con if the people are not equal in the first place. Some are established party members, rich, have a voice, have access to the media. Some are none of those things. One vote, one person, it's not an even playing field. International integration, what does it mean? If you internationally integrate into, say, the education field, does that mean you become more like the others? Or do you integrate on the basis of your difference, your unique selling point? And if you have a selling point, aren't you integrating on the basis of the same, everything for sale? Well, you know, these are not things with easy answers or answers I can give. But let's look at all those things in mind, assumptions in mind. Let's look at this publication called The Best of Both Worlds by the Confederation of Business and Industry, the CBI, in association with Middlesex University, which is a big university in London, a former polytechnic that became a university about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And this is a guide, this is the front page you can see right now, a guide to business university collaboration. Okay, please look at the picture, look at the cover that I've represented here. It's from a booklet, right? It was a 25-page booklet. And think about this, what do you see? I mean, I want you to think critically about this thing. Why they've chosen this image, why they laid it out in this way, what you see being said, what the symbols mean, what is the title meaning? Best of both worlds. Well, for starters, the world, the global, that's a thing. We talk about ontology. What is a world? Is business a world? The business world we talk about. Is the university a world? Planet University. And are they worlds that you can compare? Are we comparing apples and oranges? Or oranges and oranges? Apples and can we talk about two worlds separately like this? And in the image, you see that, I guess, on the looking at it, left-hand side is business, and business has got cogs. It's mechanized, mechanical, right? Which in the electronic 4.0 age is not correct, but it's mechanical, and they are speaking a whole lot of symbols are coming out, ways of talking. And if we look into those things, they are largely communication devices. Well, there's a clock, there's some cogs, but it's like letters, paper clips, computers, download, headphones, tweet, telephone, Wi-Fi icon. There's a lock, it's interesting, the @ symbol, and so on. And then on the other side, we have to assume that that's university, because they are on the side where the Middlesex University logo is, down the bottom. The person has no hair. It's interesting. Are they male or female? I mean, the one on the right-hand side is pretty obviously male, right? I don't know if you agree, but they to me, they look like a strapping European man. Whereas the academic side, the university side, looks something more like feminine or alien even, bald head. And in their brain is not a mechanical thing, but the atomic symbol, which is weird. And what they are so-called saying in their little speech bubble has communication technology, of course, but also a telescope, heart and a medical symbol, the atomic symbol, people speaking, though they're speaking dots, the atomic symbol again, telescope again. Well, it's very similar, but it's not the same. But what I notice very prominently, and I don't want to say that this reveals everything, but it maybe says something, that the mechanical business side is speaking over the academic side, drowning them out, so to speak. Because we don't see everything that the academic side is saying. Whereas, I mean, we don't see everything either side is saying really, because it's cut off by this diagonal. But on the whole, the business world speaks over. I can read too much into this, but I think there's something to consider here. Best of both worlds, and yet most of the business world, rather than the academic world, is seen. And the symbol right? Sponsored by Middlesex University, so it sounds like they paid for it, but published by the CBI, which is the Voice of Business. So what would the Voice of Business be? It's a lobby group to promote business interests. Now, a university can't be a lobby group. A university is about knowledge, right? Or at least that's the rhetoric. Of course, they are lobby groups, and the Vice Chancellor's Committee is a lobby group and so on. But we believe, we kind of assume, or we have a value that the university is about knowledge, whereas the Voice of Business will be just pro-business, and there'll be a lobby group. So again, these two worlds, the best of both worlds, how are they being compared? It's not a level playing field. But the Confederation of British Industry, they're allowed to bring out booklets, of course, and it's what's the booklet for? To promote the voice of business, to try and push universities to do more for business, to link up more with the opportunities of business. We then have this SWOT analysis. And I've asked you to look very closely at this. And, oh, where's it gone? Okay. SWOT analysis, I'm always a bit skeptical about whether they are not a little bit reductive. Because basically, instead of having a whole argument, you put into a little graph summaries of an argument, no quotations, no explanation, no detail, just the kind of greatest hits ideas of what we assume was a previous deeper analysis. And having been involved with making SWOT analysis, I know that that's not always the case, right? More and more the conversation starts with the simplified version, and then you write the paper to justify the SWOT analysis. But ostensibly, it should be that you do the research first and then summarize it in this kind of tabular mode of presentation. It's supposed to be a shorthand so that people can grasp the ideas quickly. That already is an assumption that these ideas can be grasped quickly, and that the simplification doesn't lose the core of the idea. But we look at what are considered strengths. New ideas and innovations of all kinds, not bounded by industry mindset, is the first one. That's a strength of business university interactions for research and innovation. So they're already working with an assumption that an industry mindset is like a bounded thing, because they're saying what's good about the interaction is it's not bounded by industry mindset. In fact, in reality, it probably is bounded, because people from industry coming to speak to universities are necessarily coming from the industry mindset. But I don't always think that an industry mindset is bounded, right? There can be members of industry that are very creative thinkers. In fact, to do well in industry, you have to not be bound by the mindset. You have to think outside the box, as they say. And yet, what the industry, the CBI, see as a strength is the possibility that by talking to a university, you'll find new ideas and innovations of all kinds. Because academics are not bound by industry mindset. The problem is, increasingly, academics are becoming bound by the requirement to be vocational. Networks of knowledge, of international cutting-edge research. Okay, so academics build international networks very well, better perhaps than business, and business wants access to that. Understood? Okay, you can see that as an advantage for business. whether it's an advantage for academics, that's up to, yeah. Excellent teams of researchers, constantly being refreshed with new talent. Well, this is the system of universities, continually bringing new people in, you, undergraduates, as researchers, and refreshing its talent, and doing so without cost to employers. Right? Socialization means that the training of researchers is funded by the researchers themselves. There's not a requirement that industry, even though it might employ them later on, pays for their training. The training is paid for by government or by private families. And you know, in a fair system, the person that profits from knowledge should probably pay for that knowledge, which doesn't mean the individual, actually, because think of it, if you did a law degree, and I'm thinking about Australian prices now because I knew Australian law degree students, and you maybe earn 100,000 a year as a lawyer, you do quite well, but the law company you work for earns 400, 500,000 from your work. Now, who should pay for the training, the 7 years of training you did that allows you, yes, to earn 100,000, maybe pays for those 7 years because you earn that money, but the company hasn't paid for any of it, hasn't made a 7 year sacrifice. They've just hired you and they profit from your work to the tune of 4 or 5 times what you earn. That's the structure of law, private law. So, and that applies in most industries as well. Dentistry, not so much in sociology, because it's hard to make a profit from employing, well, unless you employ the sociologist in HR or in management or something like that. And there's no requirement that the people who hire graduates of our faculty into HR pay any money into our faculty. So we train you up. We train ourselves, we train you up and make them available for industry free of charge. So of course they think excellent teams of researchers available, full of refreshed new talent and so on. It's a great benefit. Okay, I'm being as critical and skeptical as I can. Right, growing levels of experience of working with business and understanding of the potential benefits. It's true, increasingly universities are working with business, and there's a kind of, what do you call it, capacity building, a level of experience, a critical mass of understanding what it is to orient your research towards business. Specialist consultancy to complement the research work. Sometimes there is consultancy work. I was asked by my manager to do consultancy work, but there was no way that my material would be of relevance to anyone except for the MI6, the Secret Services, which I wasn't going to do, because I was working on resistance movements in the UK, anti-racism and so on. There was reasons for that to be a benefit for society, but no one was going to pay for that consultancy work. Well, a few get paid for it, but wider benefits and new contacts can arise from engagement. Sure. In fact, it's one of the good things about academics working with business is they then can get access to people that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily get. Right? You can't just walk in and say, tell me the secrets of your industry. I mean, because business is oriented to not do that, to protect knowledge, because it's proprietary, it's the basis of their profit. But if you work with industry, you get an access. So yeah, world-class researchers can be interested in business relevant problems and help to solve them if they are attracted by the scientific challenge. This is win-win. This is a win-win. Okay, world-class researchers should be interested in problems, yeah, and they can help to solve them. Do they necessarily then make the solutions available to that particular business? Because that business will be interested in not having anyone else get access to them. So there's a question of transparency and openness of the knowledge of the solution. Shouldn't the solution be available to everyone? That's the idea of university, universal knowledge. But business is oriented with, we want that knowledge, we want to sell the new innovation, the new product that's been, the solution that's been found, and we want to market that and profit from it. Look at the academics that have worked on the vaccines and how each of those vaccines has been sponsored by and owned by a company. It's not made available to the whole world so that you can replicate this knowledge. It's, you know, the Oxford pizza vaccine is being sold. I mean, some of it's given away as a gesture of good marketing, good advertising, good citizenship, but it's not simply put out there as open source. I mean, in computing, the idea of open source as opposed to Mac or Microsoft proprietary software is again addressing exactly that issue. A company wants to keep its ideas, its knowledge, its code proprietary to itself, whereas knowledge in a university context wants to be free, so to speak. I mean, this is an important issue and debate, right? What's next? Anyone can jump in if you want to make a comment. In addition to core strengths at technology readiness levels, TRL 1 to 3, there is a growing competence at higher TRLs. Well, this is pretty bad to include in the SWOT analysis, because anyone reading this who doesn't know what TRL levels 1 to 3 involves is just going to stop reading now, like I'm going to. I don't know what that is, and honestly, I don't remember ever coming across this before. I feel in the same way that when I first came to Vietnam and people were talking about Industry 4.0, which is not the way in which people elsewhere in the world talk about it. Right? They talk about new media or social media or the Internet of Things. Using the code word 4.0 is unique. Okay, opportunities. Universities are being encouraged to demonstrate impact from their research, and incentives for academics to work with business are growing. That's really true. The opportunity is, if you can show impact from your research, you get promotion. You get, but that's weird, because at the same time, that means your research, your choices when you do research are going to be shaped by the need to show a quick impact, right? So a traditional anthropology fieldwork, which takes 12 months and then maybe 5 years to write up, can't have a quick impact. It's really not encouraged. Rather, a couple of weeks of fieldwork and a quick report, which then is utilized for policy, gets you much more kudos, more brownie points than a big fat book on the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, which wasn't published for 7 years until Malinowski started his fieldwork in 1915. The book was published in 1922. It didn't really become famous till 27. There was no impact then. No, the long-term impact was huge, but you wouldn't have got the kind of impact that they're talking about here, and you wouldn't have got promotion nowadays. Malinowski would struggle nowadays because he wasn't doing that short-term impactful research. Whatever impact is, right? What is impact? Impact is measured as well by metrics, and we've talked about metrics. You can be a really bad researcher and be quoted a lot, and then people will say you've had impact because people are talking about your work, but they're only talking about it because it's bad. In imaginary scenario, I actually have someone in mind, but I won't say who it is. Yeah, impact is a much discussed term, and trying to define what it is has been a big debate. It's interesting. Yeah, and it's short term. Although now they have in the research assessment process in the UK impact case studies. They can take on a longer term impact. So you have to write a narrative of the impact. And there's a couple of impact studies done for each university in the assessment, but on the whole, to get anywhere, I mean, someone who has that kind of impact needs to have had it across their career and would presumably already be promoted. Whereas to use impact for getting promoted now, you need to do a short-term one. Possibility of gaining the benefits of funding from research councils, Innovative UK, and others specifically for industry-university collaboration. There are funds specifically for that industry-university collaboration. They're called in Australia CRCs, Cooperative Research Centres, cooperation between university and industry. And there are different programs of the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, and the German Research Council, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, in Germany, that are focused on working with industry, and Volkswagen Foundation, for example. Good. And yet, you might think critically about this and think, well, this is a way for businesses to get government funding to do its own research, which they will then keep, not as public knowledge, right? The question of who gets access to the results, the research in a collaboration is problematic, because the academics, of course, want it to go public so everyone can know that they did the research and they contributed to knowledge, whereas the business, the industry, wants to keep their knowledge in-house so that they can patent and deploy the new vaccine or the new knowledge. So there's a contradiction there that's not easily resolved. I mean, quite often academics have been signing agreements not to publish their research so that the company can keep the knowledge in-house. That goes against the value of knowledge for all, of knowledge as such, of university. So it's a big, this is an opportunity, but I think this is it belongs in the weaknesses and the risk and hazard column as well, of course. I mean, that can happen. We haven't got there yet. It might be there, but I don't think so, because this SWOT analysis is done by CBI. Opportunity to influence the direction and agenda of future research programs. Absolutely, industry is interested in it. My old university, La Trobe University, made a deal with a mining company, and the mining company wanted to have a say in the geography and the physics curriculum to train students to be good at identifying where in Australia the next uranium or copper or gold or whatever mineral deposits were and how to exploit them. And not to include courses that would restrict that, like on ethics or on cultural responsibility to Aboriginal owners, for example, or negotiating with landowners or traditional stakeholders. The mining company Rio Tinto Zinc owns CRA is particularly bad in exploitation of Indigenous people in Australia. And it was a real controversy to have introduced them to the campus. They built a science park. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. But, okay, it's not the on the case, and maybe influencing the direction and agenda of future research programs for the national business effort is not all right. Ability to spot and recruit the brightest young talent. Recruit. I mean, what does that mean? It means business is going to recruit the bright young academics that it finds in this collaboration. So it's going to poach people from the university. Well, you know, maybe it saves the university some money if the business pays them. But do they come back afterwards? Do they keep their jobs? Maybe they don't have jobs now because there's so few jobs in academia. We need to have more, but we don't have the money to have more. So maybe co-sponsoring posts by businesses is an opportunity. I think they could have rewritten that. Joint publication by academic and industry researchers can raise the profile and reputation of the business. What's the assumption behind that? Sounds to me like it's marketing of the business. Like the business will get publicity by being involved in research. Okay. I mean, that might be the trade-off, that an academic wants to get access to the business and the connections and the knowledge that they have in-house. And the trade-off is then they get, if they publish, they don't always publish, they then get some publicity. Yeah. Some academics are very skeptical about funded research in that way. Research that has been sponsored by industry can hardly be critical of industry. And there are questions. Research-related links can offer scope to build wider engagement, for example, in raising the skills and qualifications of the existing workforce. All right, wider engagement is a social good, no question. Raising the skills and qualifications of the workforce. See, here, this is a little bit like code words for having the universities train people for what business want them to do without business paying for that. Right? They want to influence the curriculum, and they've achieved this, right? By us continually thinking, well, all right, how do we structure the curriculum so that people will get jobs? And we think that 100% job is an important statistic to be able to quote for the university. 100% of graduates get work within the first year, and they do that because the curriculum has been geared to make potentially good employees. Who funds that? Families at present. And again, remember, it's the business that will make the most profit from that. They're getting free training. I mean, yes, you get training on the job, and sometimes that's much more relevant. But businesses are wanting the training that you get before you come and be employed by them to be more relevant. Excuse me 1 minute. Quickly. Right, Theodore, you have 11:30. You have lunch now. Okay, we'll deal with it later. Have a snack? I put snacks out. All right, I'm not going to get through all the weaknesses. Let's go a bit quicker. Weaknesses. Academics are largely free agents. If there are problems, they don't expect to go to their boss to sort it out. Yeah. Why is that a weakness? I mean, that sounds like autonomy to me. And they're self-starters. They don't drain the time of the boss and sorting out some problem. They nut out the problem and work it out themselves. And they're free agents. It means that they can think freely as well. That's number two. Not all academics collaborate well with industry. Some just want to go in their own direction. How terrible that is. I mean, that's not why is that a weakness? That's problematic that it's in the weakness. That's a positive about academia, surely. Some academics may be unfamiliar with business timeframes and market focus. Yeah. I guess if you're a scholar of ancient Greece or the pyramids, or I don't know, classical music, traditional music, pop culture. You might not, pop culture is a business after all, but you might not necessarily, well, you might be familiar with, but you might not focus only on the time frames of the market. Experienced researchers are often busy with teaching and other commitment. Well, that's true. And junior research staff, especially, and students, will be busy. They may lack depth or breadth of expertise and tend to have high turnover. You guys, stand up. No noise in here, and please at the other end. You can have your tablet there, and you can go, please. Sorry. In the other room, your room. They're on break now, so we'll have a break too. Well, we'll come to the end soon. Some academics may be unfamiliar with business timeframes. No. Experienced researchers are often busy with teaching and other commitments. Yes, it's true. Junior research staff and students may lack depth or breadth of expertise and tend to have high turnover. That was a strength before, that there was high turnover, wasn't it? I mean, there's a refreshing process. What do you mean lack depth of expertise? I mean, you know, one gets expertise by being employed and working in industry. I think that's a bit rude, really. Resources may not be on tap, and they may have to recruit for specific pieces of research. Resources means persons. Resource may not be on tap. That means persons. They're going to have to recruit people for the research project. Well, that's a bit cynical. You know, they should recruit. Of course they should. But that's not a weakness. How's that a weakness, that you have to hire someone specifically for your research project? A business needs to invest. They should be investing, not thinking that they get the research for free. University capability and excellence is scattered and not easy to spot. It's just rude. And universities compete with each other. Businesses don't. I'm sorry, businesses compete with each other in much more brutal ways. They steal off each other. They are unethical in that regard. They hang on to their this is becoming a bit problematic, I think. The way in which this is written is so biased against university. I mean, good, I'm all for a critique of university, but not just rushing to judgment like this. Universities compete with each other, that's a good thing. So some are reluctant to recognize that a rival may be a better place to go. Well, that's the nature of the game, brother. I mean, that's true of business as well. You go to Mac because it's a better kind of computer than Microsoft. Some people think the other way, Pepsi or Coke. Nature of the game. Threats, risk, and hazard. Now we get to the really serious corner, right? Negotiation of collaboration agreements can cause delays and add to business costs, which have to be written off if agreements is not reached. Yep, okay, that's certainly a hazard. Spending time talking to industry and not getting a project out of it will be a waste of time on both sides. No, not just business costs, also the time of the academics. Academics want to publish something from their research. It's what they are judged on, and may sometimes be unfamiliar with commercial approaches to IP, which is secrecy, right? That's the commercial approach to IP, intellectual property, secrecy. Whereas academics want to publish, and that's what we're judged on. So I mentioned that already. That's a university will work with the whole industry, including potentially your competitors, through competence, though competence in operating Chinese walls is growing. Chinese walls? I mean, this is not a citation of Marx's comment about how capitalism forces all Chinese walls to fall. This is actually racist. No, It's in quotation marks, but it's a cliche. And yes, a university should work with everyone because knowledge is for all, not just for the specific interests. Universities naturally want to make money out of what they invent. So basically businesses which only want to make money out of what they invent are saying universities shouldn't. I really don't understand how that's in there, and this is very biased now. A proper contract must be in place to control these risks. Sure, but should we even be signing contracts that say that we can't publish our knowledge? Should we be suggesting, controlling this idea that the university might not make money out of its inventions? It should make all of the money. Whose knowledge? Should we be having contracts that specify who will pay for the setup costs if an agreement is not reached? On the whole, in the strengths, I was a little bit skeptical. Opportunities, more skeptical. Weaknesses, I found some problems, but I am really worried about what's there in threats, risks, and hazards. I find it biased, full of assumptions, and racist. That's just my view. I don't know whether you share it. I'd like to know. Do let me know in the comments when. Wow. The next slide, we'll quickly finish this. Collaboration can also help to win the war for talent. Is a business university relationship a war? Is the best language for this militarism? I mean, the CBI is not exactly a progressive unit, but this is deeply worrying. To think of it as a war, we're in a battlefield. I mean, it's just a metaphor, sure. But there are better metaphors. You know, it might have been a car race like the guys with the champagne. It might have been the end of the Grand Prix, or it might be something else like an exhibition match or a demonstration of competence or scholarship. That might have been the metaphor, but it wasn't. The very back page of this document is an interesting one. You see the thought bubbles now. Remember the front page we had, the thought bubbles, these ones? And we saw them halfway through on this page. The voice of industry is still speaking over the voice of the academics. Now look what's happened. We just have a quote from Sir Andrew Whitty, recognized by the Queen, the Chief Executive Officer of GlaxoSmithKline, which is a pharmaceutical company heavily invested in vaccines. Universities have he says, universities have an extraordinary potential to enhance economic growth. The full diversity of institutions have a role to play, from local, small and medium enterprise support and supply chain creation to primary technology leadership and breakthrough invention. Nothing wrong with that, if you think that that's all universities do. The problem with this is university business speaking is the universities are not saying anything in this. Look at their thought bubble, their speech bubble. It's been completely drowned out. Only the CEO of GlaxoSmithKline gets to say anything. I think it's revealing. He considers the university an integral part of his supply chain, and there's no response from the other side of the conversation. We are speechless. This is not how things play in the real world, but this is a propaganda document. We have to understand it as publicity for the CBI. But you know, scholarship, it's less likely to be compromised by bias or bargaining when we keep a distance from government and corporate influence. Now, science parks is what we're going to talk about soon. By definition, a science park mixes up generally useful separation of powers. And if we want to argue that theory should be interrupted by practice, it's also the case that all practice should be interrupted by theory. Lenin, right? And the practice of bringing university and business together only on business terms needs the voice of academia to come in with a ruthless criticism of all that exists. In this context, how do we lead research teams that have international links, project-based? How we think about what they want, the users of knowledge, users of innovation, how we recruit the best people to put into that context, and how we deal with the question of export of education is what we'll start to talk about next week. So folks, that's where I come to an end. 11:36, a little bit longer than I planned, but we did have a break. So I think all's good. I didn't see how many people had done the classwork yet. Just looking at it. I have 15, 49 were not done. Please do the work, the classwork, and discuss it on the Google Classroom. I will stop the recording, but we can discuss more here on the chat if you want to hang around. But let me stop the recording for now. I'll stay, and any questions anyone has, any discussion, you talk now, or comment in the chat, or email me.